I wanted to start with a question about monitoring and evaluating supply chain partners, right? That's something that we've talked a lot about, and I think you talked about it too, Ricky. Can you give anybody here advice on where end users can go on how to monitor and evaluate their supply chain partners, and what kind of benchmarks, should we be using? I think people are real familiar with how to evaluate their own organizations, but when it comes to third parties, I think that's kind of a gray area. So can you offer us any words of wisdom on that?
Sure. So we do a few things. So number one, from a procurement perspective, we have invested a significant amount of effort making sure that our terms and conditions, our master service agreements, all those things with our suppliers meet our internal standards. And frankly, it makes some suppliers not want to work with us because we're very stringent about it. So we do it from that perspective, but then also something that Clint brought up about do you monitor intelligence that can give you indicators that some of your suppliers may be compromised? We have various threat intelligence subscriptions that we look at as well. So we manage it from a procurement perspective. We make sure that before we go into anything from a supplier standpoint, they have attestation to our standards of doing business with us. And then from a cybersecurity perspective, we monitor various threat intelligence subscriptions.
Okay. Clint?
That answer, check. That answer is going to make me tear up a little bit. That was great, thank you. Yeah, we see too many times organizations, we ask, so it's external dependency management assessment that we do. We're looking into how exactly do you enter contracts with organizations? How do you build relationships with them? And the thing that we get most is, most places they say, oh, we went to our vendors and they handed us a contract, we signed it. And we look at them and say, well, did you change the contract? Did you put your security resilience requirements into the contract? Did you put your recovery time objectives, recovery point objectives? Did you put your expectations in there? And they're like, well, no, they just told us that we couldn't modify the contract, especially when it comes to cloud services. And we're like, well, then they're covering their butt, but are you covering yours? Because you need to put what you expect out of them, and you need to hold them to that. Too many people sign a contract and then they never monitor against it. They're never looking at, are people actually meeting our needs? We had a courthouse once, and we were doing the EDM with them, and I was asking them, have you ever had one of your vendors, miss their, SLA? And he said, oh, we have one of our critical vendors, they have an SLA of 24 hours, and they missed it once. I said, oh, okay, do you mind telling me what time, when that was? And he just gave me the story about how they missed it, during a power outage. Well, the person sitting next to him said, oh, hey, I agree, but it was actually this time. And the person sitting next to him said, no, it was this time. And they went around the room where the vendor had figured out that if they called somebody different in the office every single time they missed their SLA, there was no centralized repository for reporting that they had missed the SLA, that each person in that office thought they'd only missed it once, when in the end they'd missed it 14 times in the last year. And that contract was up for renewal. How are you monitoring against your own resilience requirements? The city of Orlando, and I know Rosa would probably get mad at me, but Rosa is the CISO for the city of Orlando. And I was once, when the first time I ever got to meet her, I was going in there and she had a vendor in there. She's like, oh, Clint, just hold up a minute. She's like, I just need to finish discussion with the vendor. And she looked at this major vendor and she said, here are my security requirements. And he goes, yeah, we can't put those in the contracts. And then she said, okay, thank you, get the F out of my office. And he looked at her and said, well, but we're the largest vendor that does this. She's like, I don't care, if you're not willing to meet my requirements, then I'm not gonna do business with you. We have to speak with our pocketbooks, and if you're not willing to hold vendors accountable to what you need, not what they want to give you, then they're gonna continue to work their way. Even if you're a small company, you have rights, you have the ability to say, this is what I want in the contract. Yes, there might increase the price on you because you're getting more out of that, but that's what the business is you have to make is, am I willing to pay for more security, or do I want what they're willing to give me? You have to change the contract.
That's great advice. Put that language into the SLA and hold them accountable. I'm all for that. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, sir. Just tell us who you are and where you're from, if you don't mind.
Sure. Hi, Dave Hake from Armis. I actually have a question for each of you, but I'll go to Ricky first, if that's okay. First of all, I love your twist of phrase to digital collaboration, because IT/OT convergence is a thing. It's just not a business process or a department. It's a phenomenon. And how you manage it is collaboration. And just in your two talks between you, you mentioned, suppliers, SIs, tech stack, suppliers, B2B customers, EHS, reliability, ESG, finance, legal, risk management, divisions, regions, procurement. It's not like your department solves cyber for ExxonMobil. But my question is simply this: ExxonMobil's not a thing, like you had a chart that says OT and the business. It's 12 big businesses. It's in fact the biggest business in the whole world. How do you prioritize which business, which problem, which site, which region? I mean, how do you get up in the morning and say what's important?
So that's a very great question. So the way that we govern all that prioritization is we have created a very, what can be sometimes complex series of governance committees where each business line has representation, our engineering functions have representation, and our IT functions have representation. And it can be a challenge sometimes because just like everybody else, we have finite resources, whether those resources are people, dollars, whatever the case may be. So it is or it can be a challenging process to prioritize where we want to spend our efforts. From a cybersecurity perspective, our approach is always from a risk-based standpoint. Where are the highest consequences events that we are trying to mitigate? Let's focus our efforts there first. So there are some business lines which have lower consequence events that could be associated from a cyber incident. We want to make sure that we're capturing the mitigations for the higher consequences events. So a very risk-based approach, but still with the appropriate cross-functional representation from each of our business units, our engineering functions, and our IT department. So if you saw the governance charts, it would look quite complicated, but we need to make sure that each of those functions has a voice, has the appropriate representation, so that at the end of a prioritization effort, everybody owns the outcome. And so some business lines may not get the same amount of attention as other ones, given those high consequence events that we're focused on. But that doesn't mean that we won't address those lower consequence events eventually. We just need to focus on the higher consequence events first.
Thank you. And that's exactly what I hoped you'd say. And Clint, ExxonMobil represents what, 2 or 3 maybe of the 16 categories, and the 16 categories that you manage in your program is 1,000 SIC codes and 10,000 or more just in the Southeast companies. How do you prioritize what you care about of the 16 CNI segments, and how do you get up in the morning except to look at your email and phone and say how you're going to save the world?
Well, if you looked at my email, you would see that I have 22,000 unread emails, and that's just scratching the surface. I always tell people, you really need to get a hold of me. A phone call is going to be the best way, because between my travel and always being with partners and stuff like that, getting to email is not the thing that I do best. But that's why the program that we're building, so we have national level programs. So headquarters looks at things from a national perspective. But we've regionalized over the last 5 years, so we have regional offices in all 10 regions throughout the United States, and they're looking at things from a regional perspective. So, and then we have state coordinators in every state, and they're looking at things from a state level. And then our next level is to put people near large concentrations of critical infrastructure. When we first built this program, they wanted all the cybersecurity advisors to be in DC, and they would just fly out to whoever needed us to help them. We said, no, we want to live in the communities that we support. We want to be part of that culture. We don't want to have headquarters. We don't want DC to tell us what's important. We want the communities to tell us what's important. And that's where we are right now, is we're building relationships in those communities to say, where are the things that are important? But that's also a double-edged sword, because when we go to like a county and we say, what are the most important things in the county? The first thing the county tells us is that the county fairgrounds is the most important thing we have in the county, because that's how we generate all of our revenue. And meanwhile, they have a meat processing plant that generates 1/4 of all the chicken in the entire United States right down the road that gets hit with a cyber attack, and suddenly, chicken prices almost double. Which one should we have been paying more attention to? Well, it wasn't the county fairgrounds, it was that, chicken packing plant or whatever. So that's the struggles that we're finding, but we're finding, good partners to do it with. We partner up with, we call them Section 9 companies, and those are the too large to fail. Those are things that are outlined by the National Defense Team to say these organizations need to be the focus of our efforts in cybersecurity or in physical security even. And then we work with them to say, okay, who are your supply chain And then they start working with us, showing who they rely upon. And then we start going out in the communities. We talk to each state saying, who do you rely on? Then we talk to those things. And so we're building this network, this spider web of what's actually, as I talked about in my previous thing, that cascading effect. What one pin could I pull that causes all the dominoes to fall down? And that's what we're looking for. But we're still in the infancy of that, and that's the relationships we're trying to build.
Great answers and a great question. I think we have one more question here. Yes, sir.
Hi, Oren from OpSWAT. First of all, Ricky and Clint, thank you very much for the insights. I wanted to comment on one thing and ask a question, especially towards Clint. So first of all, I completely agree with the notion you said of how to communicate when you experience an incident. You gave one example, I think a fantastic example, maybe not because of the incident, but with how Norsk Hydro communicated around their event. They were extremely transparent. I think that provides a lot of trust to their stakeholders. I think the incident wasn't coincidental. First day of a new CEO. The other one is about communications, and I see this where I sit. Be friendly to white hackers, right? So if someone reports a vulnerability, treat them nicely, right? They're doing your job and probably seeing something that an external threat actor would also see. The question is, and you talked about recovering from ransomware. So we talked about briefly pay or not to pay, but what I'm seeing is an increasing notion of bringing in external people to help negotiate and resolve the incident. What do you think about that? I mean, there are some that say the actors will see you brought somebody from the outside, not great. The other one is don't try to reinvent the wheel when you're dealing with these people. So I'll be glad for insights on that.
Certainly. So with ransomware is always tricky. And from the federal government perspective, we're always going to ask that you please don't pay. But we also understand that it's a business decision you have to make. You know, I've given some examples over the last couple of days about if you're a hospital, you have people on life support and the life support system that gets hit, you know, or you don't have access and you really need that data. It's a decision you're going to have to make, and it's a decision you'd want to make ahead of time. But I always tell you, the bad guys are always going to find that one situation in which it's going to make you rethink what you thought you were going to say. Before I get into my full answer, I want to give you just a quick analogy. Is when I first came into the intelligence community, I had to go and do a interview with a person, and we'll just leave it at that. And this person sat down, and one of the first questions he looked at me, he was like, I'm only going to ask you one question as part of your vetting through this security process, is, would you ever give national secrets to a foreign agent? And of course, you know, me being, 21 years old and cocky, I'm like, no. And he's like, I'm going to ask you again, and I want a real answer. Would you ever give national secrets to a foreign agent? Once again, I'm looking at him like, a little less sure. I'm like, no. He's like, so if I had a gun to your wife's head, I was like, whoa, now you're playing around. He's like, what about if I had your kids? He's like, I need to know what your breaking point is. Everybody has a breaking point. Everybody has a point in which they will make a decision they didn't think they would ever make. And that translates to your company. You have a time or crisis where you're going to make a decision that you hadn't planned for. But the more that you plan, the more that you exercise, you'll be better able to make that decision or see that decision coming when you need to. So that being said, what we've seen is that most insurance companies, for people who have cyber insurance, if you look at it from their perspective, they're trying to make money. The cheapest way for them to make money is to negotiate down the ransom and pay the ransom rather than paying your incident response costs, because the cost of responding to an incident, forensics, cleaning it up, getting you back up and operational is huge. Where paying the ransom negates their obligation, like we paid your ransom, gave you the decryption key, now it's on you. And so that's the problem that we're seeing, is that the insurance community is perpetuating the problem because their first objective is to pay the ransom. Unless your company has it spelled out in your policy that, hey, we want to do everything in our power to not pay the ransom first, and then execute down. If that's our last ditch option, then that's where we're going to do it. If you leave it to them to make the decision, the insurance company will always pay the ransom first, because that's how they get out of it the quickest with the least amount of money, especially since they're usually able to negotiate the price down quite a bit. But that problem with that is that we see more people get in the ransomware market, and it just keeps building it up more and more.
Yeah, I read an interview with a Russian ransomware operative, and he said that he always goes after companies that have cyber insurance because he knows they're going to get paid. That's their preferential target. Do we have another question in the audience here? Okay.
Hi, John Cusimano with Deloitte. Thank you both for your presentations. My question has to do with assessments. So kind of core to any cybersecurity program, particularly ICS cybersecurity program, is assessments. The challenge I'm seeing, I've been in this industry for a long time, is that not every company, but there's a lot of different definitions of what is a good assessment from both the suppliers and from the asset owners and the standards bodies. So there's gap assessments, there's maturity assessments, there's compliance assessments, there's vulnerability assessments, there's pen tests, there's risk assessments that actually look at threats and vulnerabilities and rank risks. My question to either one of you or both of you is, in your experience, since I think that they kind of all have their place, but I'm interested in your thoughts in terms of what assessments do you find to be the most valuable, and in what and which assessments are right for where you are kind of in your life cycle, or which one's the right type of assessment for the application, I guess.
So I'd say the best assessment for you is anything that's going to generate an actual action item. The problem I find with most organizations when they bring an assessment team is they're either looking for regulatory compliance, which means that they're actually trying to hide where they're vulnerable or where they have issues, or they're trying to, the security team's doing it to show upper management how awesome their security team is, so they're using it to, With the assessments that we do, the cyber resilience review assessment that we do, I tell people that it's one of my favorite assessments out there because most organizations I go into, they're all smiling at me and they're all happy until I get about 20 questions in, and then they're looking at me and I say, I'm sorry, I'm about to show you your baby's ugly. Because that's what the assessment does. It shows you that everybody has limited resources. Where are your resources deployed? People tend to gravitate toward what they do well. So if you do a lot of incident response, then you have a great incident response team. But if you had a good asset management team or a good change management team, then you wouldn't need incident response teams. There are 10 domains of cybersecurity. Each domain should be assessed independent of all the other domains, and then they should be assessed together. However you want to do it, but you need to baseline and you need to say, where are my levels of acceptable risk? And then you need to say, how mature am I and what maturity fits for me? Because you're never going to get all the people you want. You're never going to get all the money you want. So maybe operating at a level 2 incident response is okay for you as long as you're operating at a level 5 asset management. It just really depends on the organization and what you're looking to do. But if it's not actionable, if there's not some action item that comes out of the assessment, then it's just a waste of your time. Because nobody needs a picture of how good they look, because we all know that you don't look good. The last thing I'll say on that is that it's all about resilience. And I always like to tell people that resilience is a lot like being healthy. Everybody in here wants to be healthy, right? Where can I go to buy health? Is there any place I can buy health? No. If you go to your doctor and you're feeling terrible, and the doctor says, okay, what am I seeing you for today? How do you feel? And you say, I feel great, there's nothing wrong with me. He's gonna be like, okay, great, we'll see you in 6 months, and you're out the door. Meanwhile, you still feel sick. If you lie to your assessments, the assessments are gonna lie right back to you. And that's the truth of the matter. You need an assessment where nobody's being held accountable for what comes out of it, but gives you a picture of how you really operate. That's the best assessment, where it's non-attribution, but you can really see how you operate.
Yeah, I totally agree. The assessment should generate action items. I'll give some examples of what we do at ExxonMobil. So first of all, foundationally, we do risk assessments based upon our own internal standards that are mapped to 62443 in the NIST cybersecurity framework for the majority of the business lines. So that's a periodic activity, and there's also a threat vector assessment that's incorporated into that. So we're not only looking at risk, but all the various threat vectors as well. That gives us an understanding of where we need to mitigate various elements of risk. And this takes place at the asset level, every business line globally. Another assessment that we do that I believe is very valuable is we have an internal red team that goes in very coordinated with the asset to align on timing, scope, et cetera, because these are production facilities. And we do red team assessments, which generates a lot of things that most people didn't really know about. All of those items that are identified may not necessarily be remediated, but they are cataloged because, again, we are in the business of managing risk. So there may be some vulnerabilities that we think are low consequences relative to the risk assessments that we do that identifies our high consequence events. But I do believe those red team assessments are extremely valuable. From an external perspective, periodically we do a maturity assessment against standards, and we bring in an independent third party to partner with us on that. To be honest, sometimes those aren't as valuable because depending on the partner that we choose, they may just tell us that we're great at everything versus telling us where we need to focus. So it's really dependent upon that partner. We've had some really great ones and some not so great ones. We were also recently just audited by our friends in the federal government from a pipeline perspective, if you know where I'm going with that. So I think, John, it's, from my perspective, foundationally, the risk assessments, understanding our threat vectors, leveraging internal capabilities like our red teams to identify where we have vulnerabilities, leveraging trusted third parties to also augment our assessment capabilities to give us that outside-in perspective. I see value in all of them. And again, we have to prioritize which ones we do and prioritize the outcome of those because we can't fix everything at the same time.
Okay. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Eric DeBoy with BP. Enjoyed both presentations, so thanks for that. Ricky, you talked a bit about the good work that you were doing to secure third parties into your OT environments, and then Clint, you talked about the bad guys' approach to island hop. At BP, we have a concept we call digital distancing because we work with a lot of third parties, a lot of vendors, and I guess I'm always looking for best practice thoughts on how to be better at distancing ourselves from our providers and third parties when they are compromised, because they do get compromised, and it's an area we're looking to improve. So, any thoughts on that?
So I like the term digital distancing. If it was up to me, we would not have any external network connections coming into our ICS environments at all because that introduces a threat vector. If a third party needed data, we would publish that data somewhere very far away from an ICS environment so they could securely go subscribe to it as needed. So, but if we were working with a third party that had some level of connectivity into our environment, going back to my comment around our threat intelligence feeds that we monitor, ideally the third party would inform us immediately. However, we would also monitor those threat intelligence feeds for indicators of compromise with the third parties that we work with. And one of the reasons that we went to that architecture that I was highlighting from an external network connection perspective, now that those network control points are managed and monitored centrally, if we did get an indicator that a supplier that had connectivity via one of those network control points was compromised or at risk of being compromised, we could sever that connection centrally. Historically, we would have to depend on the site to physically go out there and do a disconnect. We still may have them do a physical disconnect at the site, but from a logical perspective, we can do that immediately when we get notified. So I love the term digital distancing. We're trying to create what we coined at one point in time, a digital perimeter that we can manage and control, disconnect whenever we need to, always using a physical disconnect as a further measure, but it's the same concept. We want to enable the business value and minimize the threat vectors that value enablement provides. So again, if they only need data, and I have a mechanism to provide that data where they don't have to come into our environment, that's gonna be our first option. That architecture that I highlighted is only for those use cases where they need that physical connection into our ICS environments. Then we deploy that kit so we can manage, monitor, and disconnect as needed.
I agree with everything he just said. You need a business requirement for every connection, whether those are internal connections, but mostly for your third party and external connections. What do they need? How often do they need it? How are you going to provide that? What controls do you have around it? And the problem I see with a lot of organizations is you might have an insider threat program or a DLP program, but it's focused on just everybody that works at the company. You need to have a separate, part of your DLP needs to be, how are you specifically monitoring third parties and what they're doing? How do you know whether they're abusing their access, whether they're sharing accounts, What happens if somebody on one of those third parties is disgruntled with the company that they work for and they want to really show them by making them lose their biggest contract, which is with you? And so they're going to use their connection to do something bad. You don't know how the other companies treat their employees. You don't know anything about them, yet you have to give them accounts in order to do the job the business requirement that goes through there. You're taking a lot of trust with any third party. And some of that you can cover under contract. Some of it you just have to do a lot of monitoring. And I know that everything I say there, that you're like, well, that's dollars and stuff like that. Yeah, but somebody's got to look at that and assess the risk. But, if you don't need the connection, if they only need it for one day out of the month, then only enable it one day out of the month. Don't keep it on there all the time. You set your limits. The business requirement will give you your standards on what you need, how often you need it, and make them really give you the real business requirement. Not just that they need connection. Give them what ports, protocol, services, or exactly what data, and then monitor against that to make sure that's the only thing actually happening. That's probably the best thing that you can do right there. And then build a relationship. Have relationship managers assigned to each third-party contract to keep validating that business requirement, to keep validating what their cybersecurity. Audit and assess your third parties, saying, hey, are you a SOC 2 Type 2 data center? I need that certificate every year, not just the first year I went to contract with you. Every year I need to see that certificate. I need you to send me your latest vulnerability scans showing me how vulnerable you are. I need you to show me that you did a cyber exercise this last year. Hold people accountable for the programs if they're going to connect to you. Write that into your SLA, your contract, is they have to be part of your cybersecurity program.
Thanks, Clint. Do we have any other audience questions? Clint, you mentioned earlier that Flint should strive to develop better relationships with local law enforcement. Do you have any advice on how to do that? It's a good idea, but I was just thinking if I was a plant manager, how would I go about doing that? You just call the police department, or how do you do that?
Yep. Every police department I've met, every FBI agent I've met, they absolutely love it when you call them when you don't need them. They love to hear from their customers, from their partners, from people in their jurisdiction, that they just want you to come out. Think about it. Think about your fire department. Do you have comm closets that you don't want them just to run in even if there's a small fire and just start spraying water everywhere? Are there certain places they're supposed to avoid? If you invite them in every 6 months or so to say, hey, I want to walk you through our environment to show you what areas I have computers, so you're not going to use water in those areas unless it's absolutely necessary. I want to show you the buildings I have that have 24/7 operations so that you know that you need to evacuate those buildings before you start trying to fight the fire in those buildings. Local law enforcement's the same way. Bring them in saying, hey, what are your cyber capabilities? Could you help us during a time of crisis? And they might look at you and be like, hey, we have no forensics investigators. We have no real capabilities around that. Well, at least now you know that they don't. From a physical security standpoint, your physical team probably already has a relationship with them. We talk to people all the time, and somebody must have done some risk evaluation. How many of you have security guards for your organization, whether in-house or third party? Why aren't you relying on local law enforcement to be your security guards? Well, because they have other things to do. And somebody drew the line in the sand saying, hey, this is where our relationship with them will start and will end. We'll have to have our own to cover us. You need to do the same thing from a forensic standpoint. Hey, local law enforcement, what are you capable of doing? What do we need to do in-house? What do we need to have, maybe talk to CISA or FBI? Because you would be surprised at what the FBI can do for you on a recurring basis without you ever declaring a crisis. They can be some people that, if you want them to come into your facility and give you a briefing once a month on what the current threats are, they'll probably do it. If you need us to give you security clearances so that we can talk to you at a higher level, we can issue you security clearances for certain members of your staff. However you want to talk to us, we can't build our programs to what you need if you're not telling us what you need. Invite us in to exercise with you. Invite us in to just do walkthroughs with you. Invite us to be part of your change management board when we can attend. We can't always be there, but we like to do it when we are able to, because we want to know how you operate. And that's one of the pilot programs I'm working on right now. Is actually, I'm working with FedEx as one of the main people. We're trying to build a relationship management program. Is how does the federal government, not just CISA, but how does the federal government establish and build a relationship across all our different agencies with a company, and then how do we sustain that, and then how do we exercise that relationship, and how do we keep adding value to the people who need us or rely upon us, and then how do we trickle that down to their supply chains so that we're not just protecting the big people, but we're protecting everybody all at once.
Yeah, go ahead, Ricky, please.
Yeah, just having myself been in a manufacturing facility for a number of years, it is a privilege to be able to operate within the communities where our plants reside. And it is incumbent upon leadership at those facilities to have the right relationships with the community stakeholders, whether that be fire, police, or what have you. So, it's just something that I know within my company, we take that very seriously, and we do appreciate all the relationships that we have with the local municipality, our community stakeholders, fire department, et cetera. So just wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, that's good advice, thanks. I do have one more question for you too, Ricky. So you mentioned earlier about stranded data, right? And you wanted to do secure wireless monitoring of equipment in the plant environment. Can you give us a few pointers on how you got that done, or how to do that, or
Sure.
pitfalls to avoid, anything?
Many pitfalls. So we saw a significant proliferation of third parties approaching our facilities directly, trying to sell them services. And some people refer to them as industrial Internet of Things, right? Low-cost sensors that connect to a gateway that's provided by the third party, and it sends the data off to the third party cloud so the business can go look at it whenever they want. So that was a problem that we had to solve because we didn't want a multiplicity of these sensors showing up in the plants. These service providers have relationships with the facilities. They would show up. Sometimes they would give them free sensors to trial. Things would just pop up in the facility. We wanted a way to control that connectivity, especially if any of the sensors had a connection into an ExxonMobil network, which some of them did. So we started to put in some policies in educating the sites to say we want to enable this type of connectivity, but you have to do it through these mechanisms, through our network control points, so we manage the flow and the security of that data. The other item, which I may talk about at another forum, is making sure that we retain sovereignty or ownership of some of those data elements. While the site may not think it's very important that our time series data on a reciprocal compressor is flowing to a third party to do analytics on, we may want that same time series data in our data lake so that we can do broader analytics from an event correlation perspective in alignment with all the other process data surrounding that rotating equipment. So we looked at it from two perspectives: security and then data integrity and data security. So I would say if anybody is challenged with this is a subject which I can speak on for many, many hours. Come catch me after the conference. The one thing I would ask you to take away is make sure you look at both of those elements. The security of the connectivity that's being introduced into your facility. Do you need to manage and control that? And the other one is the data ownership. Is that data important to you for future use cases, which may be broader than what that individual site is looking at?
Excellent points. Well, we are at the end of our program. You heard Ricky. If you see him later, catch him and ask him any questions you want about what we were talking about here. I think Clint has to take off after this, but really appreciate both you guys coming. Great presentations and great engagement in answering the questions. And thank you guys for asking so many questions. So let's give a big hand for our presenters. And hopefully we'll see you in here in the next session at 4 p.m. Thanks, everybody.